Next, we will move on to Ms. Whitney Goulstone. She's the Executive Director of the Canadian Immunodeficiencies Patient Organization. She's participating via Skype as well. As previously mentioned, ma'am, you'll have 5 minutes for your presentation, followed by up to 15 minutes worth of questions.
Good morning.
Good morning, and the floor is yours. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, esteemed members of this committee, for allowing me to appear in front of you today. Thank you for taking the time to review this bill, listen to experts, and understand what is really happening. On behalf of the Canadian Immunodeficiencies Patient Organization, I'm here today representing the thousands of Albertans and Canadians living with primary immune deficiency disease, or PI. I myself am a patient and depend on a plasma-derived product to live. I'm happy to be able to appear before you today virtually. Like many living with PI, I've been isolating throughout this pandemic because we're a high-risk group, and the isolation will continue until more is known. Our only hope is the lifelong reliance on the plasma-based medicinal product, immunoglobulin replacement therapy, or IG. 35% of the world's plasma is used to treat PI patients in the form of IG. IG therapy is the only course of treatment. There is no alternative. Science and technology has nothing in the pipeline for us. There is no biologic, generic, or alternative coming. Science and research have brought us here to IG. Whether given intravenously in hospital through IVIG or under the skin at home through SCIG, PI patients in Alberta and across Canada rely on IG therapy for a number of reasons. These include to reduce the number and severity of infections, to reduce hospitalizations, and to increase the life expectancy and quality of life. Currently, Canada, through Canadian Blood Services, who you'll hear from later this morning, only collects enough plasma to supply 13.5% of our needs. As you know, the vast majority of Canada's plasma needs are met on the global market, with a large dependence on the US. These medicines are made with plasma collected from compensated donors. CBS's business plan currently will increase Canada's plasma supply to 50%, but this will take some time. CBS has stated that they are committed to an unpaid voluntary donor model. We support CBS's plan and want to see it succeed, and we will do what we can to work with CBS going forward. However, we believe their plan is ambitious and is unlikely to succeed without compensation in some format. We're aware that CBS has an exemption to compensate in the current legislation under special circumstances. However, it is vital that this committee understands this is not a one-off urgency. We are hearing terms like challenge, strain, and disruption in regards to supply. This is scary. No one wants to use the term shortage and panic. However, there is agreement of a looming IG supply crisis globally. Unlike conventional medication, it takes roughly 9 to 18 months from collection to fractionation to finished product, or from vein to vein. When there is a shortage, there's no whipping up a new batch quickly. The demand for IG is growing in Canada from roughly 6 to 10% year over year. As Canadians, we like to pride ourselves in our altruistic giving. In reality, only roughly 3% of the adult population are blood donors. When we think in Canada and we hear the term paid plasma, an image is conjured up of conducting things where cash is handed over for blood. It couldn't be further from the truth. The idea of compensation for a donor is not new, even here in Canada, and is practiced around the world. The European Commission for the European Parliament felt it important to distinguish between the idea of compensation and incentive when discussing blood and plasma donors. In this crucial distinction, more than half the EU member states, 24, compensate donors in the form of time off work, reimbursement for travel costs, and tax incentives. The US currently supplies over 70% of the world's plasma supply, and it is feeling the global strain. Emerging Asian markets and growing global demand is in mounting pressure. Starting in 2018, patients have reported product unavailable for pickup. This is happening in the US, the UK, and now here. Last summer, Canada experienced its first ever IG shortage when its sole supplier of SCIG, the home treatment of IG, was not able to meet its forecasted demand. It has taken CBS 20 years to build their whole blood donor base. We do not have 20 years to wait while they build their plasma donor base. We hope that this committee and this government will do all they can to ensure continued access to immunoglobulin for patients in Alberta. Thank you.
Ms. Goulstone, thank you so much for that presentation. We really appreciate it. We will now go to questions from committee members, starting with Ms. Sigurdsson. Go ahead, please.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Goulstone, for your presentation. Certainly do appreciate it. And certainly I think that we all agree that we want to make sure that Canadians have the plasma they need, and that's very important. And I have a different situation in terms of my health compared to you. Obviously, yours is ongoing, and I appreciate that must be a challenging health issue. I have leukemia, and in 2018, I had several transfusions of plasma and many blood products, and I was so grateful, of course, to our Canadian system for the support I received and the fact that I'm even still on the planet, because it was a bit touch and go there for a while. But one of the questions that I really want to understand is that distinction, between the different systems and the different provinces. And so I want to ask you, is there any difference in wait times for in provinces that do have paid plasma, like Saskatchewan and New Brunswick, compared with provinces that have the voluntary donations?
First, I'm very glad to hear that you're doing well. Congratulations on good health. Are you asking if there's differences in wait times for treatment?
For receiving the blood, because one has the system where they do get paid and the other doesn't. So I'm just wondering if it makes any difference for the patient.
Right. So, receiving whole blood and receiving plasma are two separate things. All Canadians who receive treatment in Canada receive treatment through, obviously, their provincial healthcare system, and the provincial healthcare system receives products through Canadian Blood Services. So those products, there are two companies that currently compensate donors for plasma in Canada, one in Winnipeg and the one operating in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan currently. The one in Winnipeg, it provides a product for RH factor, and the other company operating in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan does not have a contract with Canadian Blood Services. So the one operating in Winnipeg, that product goes around the world globally, including in Canada. So if you have that issue and you need that RH product, you can receive that product across Canada for that limited number of people. But the other company, their product does not stay in Canada. So the company in Winnipeg's product does come back to Canada and goes globally. But as far as wait time is concerned, to answer your question, there is it does not make a difference to paid plasma because, it doesn't make a difference because for the patients in Canada receiving plasma products, you receive your products through Canadian Blood Services to your hospital.
Right. Yeah, and so, and as your description showed, and what we've heard in this committee meeting is it's complex, the situation. But really, what I'm hearing is that having paid plasma, and having these private companies pay people to donate their plasma actually doesn't necessarily benefit Canadians, because 100% of it goes overseas to Germany or whatever. I mean, the system is just not set up for that. And if we're wanting to make Canadians, obviously Canadian blood, we want to make sure our country has that support. So that is the challenge with this, would you say?
Well, at the moment, currently, there are two companies. One company, and it's not so much it wouldn't benefit Canadians. What we don't want to see is, our supply is dropping, and it's dropping fast. 10 years ago, we were at 30%. Now we're at 13.5%. We're looking at models like Quebec's model. They were very low. They were at the same range where Canadian Blood Services is now. Now they're at 22%. However, it took them 6 years to get from 13% to 22%. So even if Canadian Blood Services start their plasma supply, which we do believe in that model, it will take many, many years to get the supply back up and running, while immunoglobulin usage is growing year over year in Canada. Also, the Canadian supply that we are using comes from the United States, where it's feeling a global growing demand. So we're having issues globally. It would help so much if Canada were able to increase their own supply. I don't think it's actually an issue of compensation necessarily. It has to do with how can we as Canadians increase our supply? How can we as Canadians assist the global supply? What are the tools we can use to do that? The Health Canada report on immunoglobulin looks very closely at that, and there is no system in the world that did any good without compensation.
Mr. Sigurdsson, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Whitney, for coming and presenting today and providing us some more insight and depth from your perspective as somebody who relies on these resources. I just want to comment, CIPO says it takes between 9 and 12 people donating between 9 and 24 hours of time to collect enough plasma to treat one patient with primary immune disorder. And I think you can agree that we'd love to get there on unpaid and voluntary, but I think what you've stated is just the time. I think this was one thing that you have expressed, is the amount of time that it's going to take to get to where we need to be is critical right now, hearing what you're hearing. So do the patients, that you represent or are speaking for, agree with incentivizing donors through some form of compensation? I mean, I love the ideas you said, tax incentives, time off work. I mean, 9 to 24 hours, that's a substantial amount of time. So is there a lot of support for those types of incentives, or even donating to a charity on their behalf?
Yeah, and you'll hear from Dr. Jaworski later today. He knows a lot more about that kind of work, but as I said, the member states in the EU look at many different kinds of incentives that don't involve handing over cash or loaded Visa debit cards, which is what the US model really is based on. But our patient population does support. We did a survey with our membership across Canada. They do support the compensation for donation. They feel the more that we can increase Canada's immunoglobulin supply, the better, because that will help ensure access to supply for them in the future. And that's what's important. We got very scared. Our patient population was very scared with the shortage last summer, hoping that they would be able to continue. Obviously, patients already on product, no one was denied product, but patients waiting for product or waiting to start treatment had to wait even longer. It's important to note that in Alberta, you have the largest clinic for PI in Canada and in North America, with over 700 patients in Edmonton. It's you have a large, very high rate of diagnosis in Canada, in Alberta. It's a large clinic, and we need to continue to support these patients.
Just to go down this road, I mean, to get your perspective, can you elaborate on the shortages of plasma therapies that patients have recently experienced, and how any impacts they have experienced during COVID-19? I think it's important that we get that perspective from your perspective as a treatment patient.
So there haven't been any shortages during COVID. There's been some issues with supply from the vendors with vial sizes, things like that, but no shortages. We had a shortage last summer with the in-home treatment, and in Alberta, there was one patient who had was in the ICU with an infection. One PI patient had an infection and ended up in the ICU, and there was a patient with some abscesses while waiting to go on to treatment. So we did have some issues in Alberta for sure while waiting for treatment and waiting to go on to treatment because treatment was delayed for in-home treatment. Those patients did have access to IVIG, but IVIG is once a month and not once a week. So there were a couple of issues in Alberta in the Edmonton clinic due to the shortage. But the shortage lasted 4 months. It was short relatively, and that was due to forecasting of demand.
Thank you. Member Pancholi, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Goulstone, for being here and for bringing your personal story, but also the perspective of so many of the people that are part of your group, and it's important to hear from patients, so I thank you for that. I wanted to ask a little bit about, I think overall we're all kind of coming from the same perspective of the fact that there's clearly a shortage of plasma and trying to find opportunities and strategies to improve our plasma access. In Canada specifically, of course, we're talking about Alberta here. And I'm wondering, I understand, I did a little bit of research and reading into some of the history of paid donations, and in Saskatoon, of course, they do allow for paid plasma in Saskatchewan, and I understand CPR opened up a site in Saskatoon. And shortly, or a little while after that opening up, I understand that the Canadian Blood Services raised some concerns about the fact that the opening up to paid plasma actually decreased the voluntary donations, and they sort of raised that concern that by it didn't actually increase the self-sufficiency in Saskatchewan with respect to plasma by opening it up to paid plasma. And I'm wondering if you have any understanding or experience with what happened there, and if you could share your thoughts on the fact that in that situation it did not seem to increase voluntary donations or access to plasma.
Yeah, happy to address that. I think that Dr. Scher would be able to address that a little further when he's here. As far as I'm aware, and our organization is aware, that is anecdotal data, and there hasn't been a research study done to look at that data further. But we're not aware of any hard data showing crowding out in that area. But if he has some, I would love to see it, and we would obviously, support any efforts they have to bring those donors in. But as far as we're aware, and from the Health Canada study, they didn't correlate any crowding out data in Health Canada study. I think it's important to note that this legislation we hope it's not just about one company. I think if you open a door, you can't just say, well, we'll open it for one company, we won't open it for this company, we'll open it for, you need to be able to say, very reactionary legislation is dangerous. So it's important to note that it's not just, that one company, CPR, which, we don't know much about, but I know they're only operating in 2 places with very limited capacity and collecting very limited amount of supply.
Okay, follow up, please.
Thank you, and I appreciate that response. One of the things that I think has been noted already is that Bill 204 that's before us today is a very short bill because it essentially just repeals the Voluntary Blood Donations Act. It doesn't have any other provisions in it other than repealing that act. And again, coming back to the focus is about trying to increase access and plasma in Alberta. One of my concerns would be is that simply by repealing the Voluntary Blood Donations Act, which did have a specific exception for research, right? So I heard your comments around, there's 2 pieces of this. There's access to plasma that patients who have medical conditions may require, but also about scientific research, which led to the development of IG in your specific situation. And so part of my concern is that by simply having a bill that repeals the Voluntary Blood Donations Act, there's nothing in there to actually encourage or mandate that private or paid plasma collection would actually come back to Alberta. So if we're trying to talk about supply, are there things that should be done, in your view, legislatively, that would actually increase private or collection, other than just repealing the Voluntary Blood Donations Act? It doesn't seem to have any other measures in place to encourage that donations and those collections stay in Alberta. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, in my opinion, and in our organization's opinion, we really do believe this is a gray area. It's not black or white, and there's a lot of room for private-public partnerships, and that's our belief.
Okay, Member Glasgow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know, and thank you, Ms. Goulstone, for presenting to us today. I know that this is obviously a very personal issue for you, as you rely on these donations. And we've had some conversations around incentivization and compensation for plasma donations. And I was wondering if you could maybe comment. I know some of the members opposite, as well as many Albertans, which I think it's a very fair criticism, are concerned about vulnerable populations, maybe coerce is the wrong word, but maybe being incentivized to...
I'll allow the completion of the question and the answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So many are concerned about the incentivization process, maybe gathering poor plasma. So if you could just comment on that, I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. Obviously, there's a lot of, again, anecdotal data. It's not actually been researched, but it's very provocative in the media to be able to say they've opened up this plasma donation center across from a homeless shelter. There is a lot of hard data that does show the quality that the FDA, Health Canada, and all of the organizations have to go through the rigorous testing for the donor health and the health of the plasma itself. So we can say without fail that in over 25 years, there has not been a disease transmission in a plasma product.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Ms. Goulstone, thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you very much to all members for asking questions. Again, Ms. Goulstone, you're welcome to stay on the line as long as you put yourself on mute. Appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.